All right, let's take a look at section 4. Here's your focus question. America's narrow definition of nationhood was projected abroad in the late 1890s as the U.S. became an imperial power in the world. The last quarter of the 19th century is known as the Age of Imperialism, when rival European empires divided large parts of the world among themselves. In this period, the U.S. was considered a second rate power and not included in imperial competition and diplomacy. Although large land-based empires such as the Russian, Ottoman, and Chinese empires, and overseas empires such as the British, French, and Spanish dominated much of the 19th century, after 1870 a new imperialism emerged, dominated by European powers and Japan. Belgium, Great Britain, and France consolidated their colonies in Africa, and Germany acquired colonies on that continent. The British and Russians intensified their struggle to control Central Asia, and all European powers competed to control parts of China. By the early 20th century, most of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific had been divided among these empires, each of which justified its domination of other peoples in the name of bringing civilization to backward peoples who required instruction in Western values, government, Christianity, and labor practices. Territorial expansion had been part of American life from the beginning, but the 1890s marked a major transformation of America's relationship to the rest of the world. Americans more and more saw their nation as an emerging world power. Until the 1890s, the expansion of the United States had been in North America, though ever since the Monroe Doctrine, many Americans had seen the Western Hemisphere as an American sphere of influence. Americans talked of acquiring Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other territories, but the only territory acquired after the Civil War was Alaska, regarded by many as worthless. Most who looked overseas wanted to expand trade, not take new possessions. Many farmers and manufacturers believed that America's production could no longer be absorbed in domestic markets and thought overproduction was causing recurrent economic crises. They wanted foreign customers for their products. Christian missionaries actively spread American influence overseas in the late 19th century. Groups like the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions believed it was their mission to prepare the world for Christ's second coming and enlighten the heathens abroad. A few late 19th century thinkers actively promoted American expansionism. Josiah Strong, a well known Congregationalist clergyman, tried to update Manifest Destiny in his book Our Country in 1885. He argued that Anglo Saxon Americans who had shown their ability for liberty and self government in North America should spread their institutions and values to inferior races overseas who, he suggested, would benefit American manufacturers by becoming new customers of their goods. Naval officer Alfred T. Mahan, in The Influence of Sea Power Upon History from 1890, argued that no nation could prosper without a large merchant fleet engaged in international trade and a powerful navy to protect it, which required overseas bases. Mahan insisted that with the western frontier closed, Americans had to look overseas for opportunity. Mahan influenced James G. Blaine, President Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State, who advocated the acquisition of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba for naval bases. In 1893, American planters in Hawaii organized a rebellion there that overthrew the native Hawaiian government of Queen Liliuokalani. Though Harrison asked the Senate to pass a treaty of annexation, President Grover Cleveland withdrew it. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. annexed the Hawaiian Islands. The depression that began in 1893 intensified Americans' belief that an aggressive foreign policy would create markets for manufactured goods. By the late 1890s, papers like William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, dubbed the Yellow Press by their critics after the color in which Hearst printed a popular comic strip, were selling million copies a day by mixing sensational accounts of crime and political corruption with aggressive appeals to patriotic sentiments. Many factors contributed to America's emergence as a world power in the Spanish-American War of 1898. But the war's immediate cause was Cubans' long struggle for national independence from Spain. 10 years of guerrilla warfare began in 1868 and revolt resumed in 1895. Reports of Cuban civilians suffering in Spanish detention camps aroused outrage and sympathy in America. Cries for intervention increased after February 15, 1898, when an explosion, probably accidental, destroyed the USS Maine, which was an American battleship in Havana Harbor, killing 270 sailors. When Spain rejected American demands for a ceasefire and eventual Cuban independence, Congress approved President McKinley's request for a declaration of war, which was justified as a humanitarian intervention. Congress adopted the Teller Amendment, declaring that the U.S. had no intention of annexing or dominating Cuba. The war was brief and resulted in only a few hundred American casualties, what one official called a splendid little war. The war's most important battle actually happened in the Pacific Ocean, in Manila Bay in the Philippines, a Spanish colony where Admiral George Dewey defeated a Spanish fleet. The most publicized land battle of the war involved the assault on San Juan Hill outside Santiago, Cuba, made by Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Roosevelt was pro-expansionist and believed war would unite the nation and its men, whose masculinity he thought had suffered in the economic crisis of the 1890s. Although Roosevelt organized the Rough Riders to be a cross-section of America, it excluded blacks, and Roosevelt neglected to mention that black troops had actually reached the top of San Juan Hill before his troops. But Roosevelt's exploits made him a national hero, and after being elected New York's governor that fall, he became McKinley's vice president in 1900. The war to liberate Cuba soon became an imperial mission that culminated in the creation of a small overseas American empire. McKinley would not return the Philippines to Spain or hand it over to the Filipinos, who had fought for independence because he didn't believe they could govern themselves. He also spoke of Americans' duty to uplift and civilize the Filipinos and train them to rule themselves. In the treaty ending the war, the U.S. acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Before McKinley recognized Cuba's independence, he forced that island's new government to approve the Platt Amendment to the new Cuban Constitution, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba with its military whenever it saw fit. Cuban patriots were extremely disappointed by what they saw as America's betrayal, and such resentments helped inspire the revolution in Cuba 50 years later. Americans' interest in their new insular possessions had more to do with trade than settlement or extracting resources, however, and they saw Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in the Pacific the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii, as outposts for trade to Latin America and Asia. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay declared the open door policy, demanding that the European powers that had divided China into commercial spheres of influence allow equal trade access to America. Western influence and presence in China soon led to the Boxer Rebellion, in which Christian Chinese and foreigners were targeted by Chinese nationalists, and American troops helped quell the uprising. While many Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans had welcomed American intervention as a means to wrest independence from Spain, continued American control, direct and indirect, quickly alienated these patriots and others. After victory in the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the independence movement there, established a provisional government with a constitution modeled on that of America. When McKinley decided to retain possession of the islands, the Filipinos rebelled. A second longer and far more bloody war ensued, lasting from 1899 to 1903, costing the lives of more than 100,000 Filipinos and 4,200 Americans. The Philippine War was hotly debated in the United States, where reports of atrocities against Filipino civilians, including burning villages, torture, rape, and executions, seemed to damage America's image as a liberator. McKinley's administration justified the war as an effort to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, although most residents were already Catholics. The American colonial government, led by William Howard Taft, quickly modernized the islands with railroads, schools, public health officials, and modern agriculture. But American policies in its new possessions tended to favor land-based local elites, whether native-born or American, and usually created persistent poverty for the majority. American rule came with American racial attitudes. In the 1899 poem, the British writer Rudyard Kipling asked the U.S. to take up the white man's burden of imperialism. American supporters of empire felt that white domination of non-white peoples represented the progress of civilization. But America's new empire sparked an intense debate about the interrelationship of democracy, race, and American citizenship. America's governmental system had no provision for permanent colonies, and the right of every people to self-government was a key principle of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's idea of America as an empire of liberty assumed that new territories would eventually be admitted as new states, and its residents would be American citizens. Yet, after the Spanish-American War, nationalism, democracy, and American freedoms seemed aligned with the ideas of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Both Democratic and Republican leaders who wanted to retain the new possessions feared negative consequences of incorporating alien races into America. The Foraker Act of 1900 declared Puerto Rico an insular territory different from previous territories in the American West. Its 1 million inhabitants were defined as citizens of Puerto Rico, not the United States, and were denied a future path to statehood. Filipinos were given the same status. In a series of cases decided between 1901 and 1904, known as the Insular Cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not fully apply to overseas territories held by the U.S., thus sharply limiting the extent of American freedom. Congress had to recognize the fundamental rights of these new peoples, but could otherwise govern them as it saw fit for an indefinite time. Hawaii became a traditional territory and was admitted as a state in 1959. The Philippines became independent in 1946. Although Congress gave American citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, Puerto Rico has the status of a commonwealth, neither a state nor a territory, which has its own government but lacks a voice in Congress and presidential elections. America's racial attitudes had a global impact in the age of imperialism. Global concerns about immigration, race relations, and the white man's burden seemed to inspire solidarity among Anglo-Saxon nations. Chinese exclusion and segregation in the Jim Crow South influenced discriminatory laws in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Other nations seemed to learn from Reconstruction's failure that multiracial democracy was impossible. America's new empire caused intense debate and controversy. Opponents formed the Anti-Imperialist League, which united writers and social reformers who wanted reforms at home, businessmen who thought overseas empire was too expensive, and racists who did not want non-whites brought within the United States. The League warned Americans that empire was incompatible with democracy and urged Americans to help Puerto Ricans and Filipinos gain their independence. In 1900, the Democrats once again nominated William Jennings Bryan to run against President McKinley, and the Democrats' platform opposed the Philippine War for militarily subjugating a foreign people, demanding liberty and self-government. The president of the Anti-Imperialist League declared that the nation's most pressing question was whether the nation would be a republic or empire. Proponents of American empire embraced the language of freedom too. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana argued that America sought abroad not material resources or national power, but desired only to bring freedom to other peoples. America practiced a benevolent imperialism that would uplift backward cultures and spread liberty. America, Beveridge argued, only went abroad for trade, not to rule other nations. McKinley, benefiting from economic recovery and a swell of patriotism from winning the Spanish-American War, beat Bryan in 1900. At the start of the 20th century, America seemed ready to become a great power. Writers at home and abroad predicted that American influence would soon pervade the globe. In his book, The New Empire, Brooks Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, predicted that America's economic might would make it outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. This did not happen until after World War II, but the characteristics that would constitute America's global strength were already present in 1900. The U.S. had already surpassed European competitors in industrial production. The merger movement of 1897 to 1904 left much of the economy controlled by corporations. Politics had stabilized, and the white North and South had reconciled, while hardened racial lines, segregation, Chinese exclusion, Indian reservations, limited the boundaries of citizenship and freedom. Yet questions central to 19th century debates over freedom, such as the relationship between economic and political liberty, the role of government in creating the social conditions for freedom, and the definition of citizenship and national identity, had not been answered definitively. They would continue to be central to American life in the 20th century. So there's our fourth section, and that will take care of it. We'll see you next time.